Hello, I hope you're all doing well. Alex from What Page Are You On has tagged me to do the My Favorite Fiction Books tag. This is a tag where you talk about your 10 favorite novels. The only rules are they have to be from the 21st century. There can be no canonical classics. The number one in the list has to be your number one choice, and at least one of the books has to be connected to somebody else's list. Creating this top 10 list has made me realize how relatively few books I've actually read from the last 2 decades. I was thinking it would be hard to choose 10, but actually when going through my Goodreads, I found that there wasn't much more than 10 books that really stood out for me as favorites. So aside from my number one favorite, I have listed these books in chronological order. By the way, all of these books I've actually only read once, and some of them I read quite a long time ago. So while they're all books that I want to reread, I may reread them in the future and find that I actually don't love them as much as I thought. But going off my memory of them, I remember them being amazing. The first book is Under the Skin by Michel Faber, which was published in 2000. I read this about 4 years ago, and I remember thinking I need to read more of this author, and I have not done so. This is one of those books where you can't really say anything about it because it will spoil the whole book. All I can really say is that it starts off with a woman driving around in a car in Scotland, and she is picking up hitchhikers. Why she does this and who she really is turns out to be quite sinister. I remember loving the writing of this book. I remember loving the atmosphere. It would actually make a really good sort of spooky Halloween, October themed read. For the most part, the reason I loved it is because it had very overt animal rights themes, which is obviously something that is going to appeal to me. I reviewed this book in my very first booktube video, and looking back over that video, I said that I couldn't imagine someone reading this book without going vegan. I have no idea whether the author Michel Faber is vegan or vegetarian, and maybe it's just because we can't help but project our personal thoughts and feelings onto stories, but I couldn't imagine anyone going into that book without coming out at least understanding a bit more about why vegans feel and think the way they do. Really, it's just a fascinating look at the human condition and the hypocrisies that we live under within our current society. Next, I have Spies by Michael Frayn, which was published in 2002. This was a book my mum recommended to me back, I think, in high school. The reason she loves it is because she was born in the UK and moved to Australia when she was 6 years old. She was actually one of the last of what we call the 10-pound poms, British people who were encouraged to immigrate to Australia on boats because it only cost £10, though I have a feeling her fare probably cost more by then. But she has always had, I guess, a romantic view of the UK and her childhood experiences of living there, and she said this book captured so perfectly what she remembers. This book is set during World War II, and it's about 2 little boys who live in a cul-de-sac in a suburb somewhere outside of London. It's the summer holidays, so they are playing all day and have all kinds of imaginations about the Germans, which lead them to uncover uncomfortable secrets in their own families. I genuinely don't really remember more than that, which is something that my brain does, just seems to forget the details of any story I've read, but I do remember the writing being incredible. I remember it so vividly invoking this atmosphere of childhood, summer times, and it also reminds me of my mum as well. It's definitely one I'm looking to reread very soon. Next, I have The Messenger by Markus Zusak. I would have put The Book Thief on this list, but I wasn't quite sure exactly what is meant by no canonical classics, and I thought maybe The Book Thief would be considered a classic because it is so well known, so I thought I would pick Markus Zusak's earlier novel instead. This one is also published in 2002, and it follows a young man called Ed Kennedy who is not exactly going places. He works as a cab driver and likes playing cards, and he's in love with his best friend Audrey, and he has a dog, but he begins to get playing cards in his letterbox with messages on them, and that sort of starts this whole adventure and this coming of age tale. Again, I read this a long time ago, so I don't remember the details. I just remember really enjoying it, and that I felt that it really accurately represented Australia and Australians. I really enjoyed the mystery aspect of it, of Ed having to solve who is sending him these cards, and these messages send him out on little quests where he goes out and meets other members of his community. And I love how different it is from The Book Thief as well. It really shows the diversity of the way Markus Zusak can write. I basically am going to say this about every book on this list, but also one I want to reread really soon. Next, I have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This was published in 2005, and this is the book on my list that I am linking to Alex's list because he had Remains of the Day as one of his favorite books. I absolutely adored this when I read it a few years ago. I had already seen the film before reading the book, unfortunately, so the twist in here was not a surprise for me, but regardless, I still enjoyed it so much, which I think think is such a testament to Ishiguro's writing. This is another book where you can't talk about the plot too much so as not to give it away, but it starts off being about a group of students who seem to be living in a boarding school in the English countryside somewhere. The real reason as to why these children are all living in this big house is something much more sinister than simply education. I very much love the Britishness of this novel. The film version has a kind of mix of like 1940s but also 1980s style to the costumes and the setting, so I couldn't help but imagine the same thing when I was reading the book, but it does evoke this kind of nostalgia without ever pinpointing an exact era, which I think is very impressive. And I really love the kind of sci-fi, because this does end up being a little bit sci-fi or dystopian maybe, that is set in a very real world setting. You could say the same for Under the Skin. That certainly gets very sci-fi at the end, but I love when those types of themes and ideas are interwoven with something that's a bit more tangible with a real life setting. Next I have Animal People by Charlotte Wood, published in 2011. This is another book that I would say very accurately represents, well, at least white Australia. This one is specifically set in Sydney and is set all on one day about a man who works at the zoo and talks about how he feels like he is in a rut in his life, and all about his family members who seem to be much more successful than him. I love things that are set in a really short space of time, and the way this book talks about this really specific hot summer's day is just so accurate to what it's really like in Australia in summer. It's a book that mainly just muses on the life of middle-class Australians, and it has so many ideas and thoughts that I thought was so interesting and pertinent. With Charlotte Wood, I have not so much enjoyed the other books of hers that I've tried, but there's something about this one that I just absolutely love. Next is We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves by Karen Joy Fowler. This is another book where unfortunately my mum spoiled the twist for me when she was recommending the book, which did really annoy me because I think I would have had a very interesting experience if I hadn't known the twist about a character, Rosemary, and her sister Fern, who has disappeared. And Rosemary is at college looking back at her childhood and going through all the things one goes through at college. I also reviewed this at the same time as Under My Skin, and I was very much drawn to it because of the animal rights themes within it. Under the Skin is very much talking about factory farming. This one is talking about the way humans treat animals more generally in terms of discrediting their intellect and their autonomy. Next, I have one that I always have trouble saying, The Underground Railroad. There's something about the two R's in railroad that I struggle with, by Colson Whitehead, and this was published in 2016. This was one of my favorites of the year. I think it was 2017 when I read it. In this book, the Underground Railroad is turned into an actual railroad. This is why we say railway in Australia, because railroad is too hard to say. In this book, Whitehead has turned the Underground Railroad, which was used to help get slaves to freedom in America, and he has turned it into a real underground railroad to allow his protagonist Cora to move easily around different states in America so he can discuss the different way that different states abuse black people during this time. I just thought this book so cleverly interwove those kind of fantastical elements of a railroad with the real life horrific things that happened pre-Civil War era, and the way that the author connects them to things that are still happening now is just incredibly powerful. I feel like I learnt more from this book than probably any other book I've read about slavery, and if you haven't read this one before, I would definitely recommend putting it on your TBR. Next, I have My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. I read this when it came out and was definitely one of my favorites of the year as well. This is about an unnamed protagonist who decides she wants to sleep for a year, and I think we can all agree that is the most tantalizing idea. I've read all of her other novels and didn't really like them that much, whereas I adore this one so much. It's funny, I guess, how an author can write one book that just happens to intersect with your reading tastes in the right way, I guess. But I really loved the protagonist's voice in this. I really loved the setting of the early 2000s. It was so interesting to read about a time that I was alive in, but was very much a child. I wasn't really aware exactly of the significance of everything that was going on at the time. I just remember reading this so fast and loving every single second of it. So my penultimate choice for this list is Normal People by Sally Rooney. This had to be on this list. I think it's going to be considered a classic in the future. character? Well, I think I enjoyed the character in Conversations with Friends more. I think I enjoyed Normal People as a whole much more. I think Sally Rooney refined her writing style so perfectly. The way she was able to write from both Connell and Marianne's perspective and make them so distinct was amazing. And the fact that the characters went to university during the exact same years that I did as well, although they had a very different uni experience than I did. I guess it made me feel for the first time that I was reading something really intended for me, which I guess is something that you get as you get older, when people your own age start being the ones to create the stuff that you read and see on screen. And my number one favourite of the last 2 decades has to be On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan, and this was published in 2007. This really combines so many of the things that I love to read about. It's set in Britain, it's set during the last century in Britain as well, during the 60s. It talks about the cultural shift between the sort of late 50s, early 60s and the youth revolution that kind of happened during that decade. But it's also this tiny, small story about these 2 people who are in their early 20s and have just got married and are about to have sex for the first time, and it flashes back to how they met, and you slowly discover that what seems on the surface as this ideal marriage is nothing of the sort. I really love the frank discussions about sex and the ridiculous ideas we have around it, around the concept of virginity, around men's entitlement to having sex, and of course around the idea of not having sex before marriage. As I mentioned in my original review, there is a small part of it that gives an explanation to the way that the female character, Florence, feels about sex, which I felt was completely unnecessary, because she is perfectly valid to not want to have sex with this man without having a tragic backstory. So that annoyed me a little bit, and if I could erase that out of the book, I would. But aside from that, I just think this is a perfectly crafted tiny little novel that I know I will be returning to again and again over the years. So that is my top 10 books from the 21st century so far. I'll tag a few people in the description, and feel free to consider yourself tagged if you want to do it. In the comments, let me know your favorite book from the last 2 decades. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.